We're joined today by Jim Lee, President and CEO of Susquehanna Polling and Research. Pennsylvania has been in the national spotlight for the past several months, with both major party presidential candidates being in the state numerous times, particularly over the last several weeks as we get close to Election Day. Do you think that the oversaturation of candidates has had any impact on the public's willingness to participate in polls?
That's a good question, Francine. The participation rate has been going down for surveys for years now, and that's primarily because people just don't want to be reached at home now. They want to be able to do the survey at their convenience if they can log into it with maybe an internet connection or take it on their phone. But the response rate hasn't been as helpful as we would like, but I don't think the oversaturation of candidates and TV ads is really skewing that any further. So, we have to make more calls to get surveys done right now, and we expect that, but I don't think that the participation rate has been adversely affected by the saturation of candidates and campaign advertising.
As we speak on October 30th, your latest poll is just being released today. So I'd like to take a look at some of that data.
Sure.
First question, what issue will most influence your vote? I have the first top responses. Inflation and economy came in top at 45%, illegal immigration at 32%, protecting democracy at 28%, crime and public safety at 23%, and abortion access at 22%. Did anything surprise you here?
Yeah, what surprised me was that illegal immigration was so high. I mean, it ranks above other, traditional issues like taxes, which is always kind of a pain in people's sides, and crime and public safety, which is an issue that, let's face it, if you don't feel safe in your community, that's a big deal. So the immigration issue is one that the Trump campaign has been using very aggressively in their narrative. They have been making the election for president a referendum on the open border policy that the Biden and Harris administration have really overseen for the last 4 years. And that, I think, plays to Trump's strength in this survey. So the fact that illegal immigration polled so high is surprising to me. The inflation in the economy, I don't think that's a surprise. I mean, everyday Americans are struggling to pay their bills. We all face it when we go to the grocery store, when we go to fill up our car at the gas pump. Everything costs more right now. It doesn't matter what it is, the cost of rent, the cost of housing, the cost to purchase or make a loan payment, grocery bills. So people are very, very concerned about the economy and inflation in particular. And even though there's some metrics that suggest the economy is doing well, for instance, unemployment is relatively low, GDP growth has been fairly robust over the last few quarters, the stock market's doing really super well. There are economic indicators that suggest that the economy is on solid footing, but people don't feel it. They don't feel it. And that's why I think you see immigration and inflation as the top two issues in this survey. So those would be, I think, the two that really will influence people's vote choices in November. And we can talk more about that when we get into the presidential election, if you'd like.
Do you think that the responses regarding issues of importance gives you any indication of how people will vote, particularly in that presidential race? Yes.
In fact, when we looked at those particular types of voters, so if you're an inflation voter, in other words, you said in this survey, inflation is one of the issues that will most influence your vote. You are voting for Donald Trump in the race for president by a 57-35 margin. That means that if you go to the polls and you're worried about inflation, 5 times out of 10, you're voting for Donald Trump. That means that his narrative that if you like the way inflation is, vote for my opponent, is working because people are responding to that message that he is communicating to voters, which is, I'm going to do something about inflation. The Harris-Biden administration has had 4 years to deal with this. They haven't. Your prices are still high. we need to make a change in the White House if we're going to do anything about inflation. The immigration voters, if you look at people that say immigration is a top issue, they're voting for Trump by a 72 to 17 margin in the race for president. So, wow. I mean, he has got those immigration voters in his pocket. That seems to be the real emotional issue of this cycle. I mean, when you talk about the economy, I don't think people get excited about it, but when you hear people in our surveys talk about immigration, they talk about it very passionately. They're worried about the open borders. They're worried about the fact that we have people coming across the borders that have criminal records, that have terroristic tendencies, that are bringing drugs and fentanyl into the country, that are taking jobs away from other Americans. So the immigration issue is one that people feel very passionately about, and we see that in our surveys all the time. So those two issue groups are breaking more towards Trump, which is favorable for him. Some of the other categories here, like abortion access, it didn't rank as one of the super high ones, but if you go to the polls thinking about abortion access, you're voting for Kamala Harris by a 71 to 21 margin. She has made it a referendum on Donald Trump. That's her goal, is she wants people to go to the polls and think about reproductive rights and the fact that Trump is the candidate that, when he was president, put 3 Supreme Court justices on the court that overturned Roe v. Wade. So if you care about reproductive freedoms and the right to just make those decisions between you and your doctor, you should vote for her. Another issue that polls here is protecting democracy. It's kind of the catchphrase this year because Kamala Harris has been very, very, I think, bullish about trying to convince Americans that Donald Trump is a legitimate threat to our democratic system, partly because he refused to accept the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. And then, of course, we had the insurrection on January 6th and all the, festivities surrounding that, which were horrible for our nation. So if you say protecting democracy is one of your top issues, you're voting for Harris by a 65-23 margin. The other issue that favors Kamala Harris is health care. That's a big issue to a lot of Americans, access to affordable health care. And under President Obama, the Affordable Care Act was something that gave millions of Americans access to affordable, quality health care. And insurance companies had to take you as a subscriber, even if you had a pre-existing condition. So Kamala Harris's campaign has tried to stress the fact that if we elect Donald Trump president, we go backwards because he wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act. That'll take away access to health care for millions of Americans. So if health care is one of your top issues, you're voting for Kamala Harris by 70 to 27 margin. So these issues really do give us some insight, kind of like a prism into how people are voting, which is fascinating to me.
I'd like to zone in on one of the items that you talked about. Abortion access came in at 22%. 2 years ago, the Dobbs decision was credited or blamed with helping Democrats at the polls. Do you think this issue holds as much significance this year?
I do. Even though it doesn't rank as high in this top line number, remember, these results reflect the interviews with Republicans, Democrats, and independents. But among Democrat voters, that is their number one or number two issue. It ranks ahead of immigration. It ranks ahead of taxes and spending. It ranks ahead of health care. That's very much what I call a galvanizing issue for people, particularly for Democratic voters, that will get them to the polls. So while it might not poll very high on the surface, I think it's really like lighting a fuse under the Democratic base. It will drive those voters to the polls. And it's why we see that women in our surveys tend to be more supportive of Kamala Harris than men are, because women take the issue of reproductive freedoms so much more seriously than maybe their male counterparts do. My own daughter sent me a tweet the other day saying, "Dad, make sure you think twice about who you're voting for, because, your daughter is in that age group where I'm in childbearing age group. If God forbid I was ever raped or there was ever a situation where I had to have that kind of a decision made, there's one candidate that supports my reproductive freedoms and one that doesn't." So she was lecturing me on the importance of that issue to females.
Let's move on and look at the presidential race now. The Democratic candidate Kamala Harris comes in at 46%. The Republican candidate Donald Trump at 45.8%. Other 0%, not sure, undecided at 6%. How do these results compare to what you've tracked in this race since Kamala Harris entered it over the summer?
When Kamala Harris first got in the race, it was in mid-July when Biden first tapped her to be the official nominee. We went into the field with a poll just days later, and we found that Kamala Harris was up by 4 points in that poll over Donald Trump. She seemed to be enjoying a little bit of a honeymoon period at the beginning. The American public was just getting to know her. There was a lot of excitement about her campaign, particularly from the Democratic constituencies, and she was leading. Fast forward to our October poll, and it looks like her numbers have settled a little bit. This race is a statistical tie. It doesn't get any closer than that. When I look under the hood, you see basically 9 in 10 Republicans are voting for Donald Trump, and 9 in 10 Democrats are voting for Kamala Harris. Who does that leave? Independent voters as the deciding swing vote. They are leaning towards Donald Trump right now by a 44-36 margin. Now, why is that important? In 2020, Francine, the exit polls showed that Joe Biden carried independent voters. They are people that represent about 16% of our total voter registration rolls. They are not wedded to either party, so they become the critical swing vote in most elections. How the independents vote usually carries the day for that particular party. Right now, they're leaning towards Donald Trump, whereas in 2020, the exit poll showed they voted by a bigger margin for Joe Biden. That's pretty significant. That means Trump has maybe a slight edge in the upcoming election because it looks like independents are leaning slightly towards him. But neither candidate is over 50% in this poll. They're both going to be very, very pleased with these results because it shows that whichever party gets their turnout up, whichever party really gets their voters to the polls, could really be the deciding factor. And what's particularly interesting about turnout this year is the Republican Party has really done a lot of strong work on the ground to register new voters. There was a time when Democrats had about a 700,000 voter registration advantage in this state. That's now been literally sliced in half. Their margin now is only about 250,000 more voters. That's still a lot of people, but in percentage terms, that's only a 44 to 40 differential now in terms of percent of the population. So what that means is that if the Republicans, it's almost like we're a 50-50 state in voter registration. So if Republican voters get their vote out a little more than Democrats do, that could really tip the election in Donald Trump's favor. Conversely, if the turnout falls along the lines of voter registration, which is that slightly more Democrats show up to vote than Republicans, then Kamala Harris could be elected president in Pennsylvania. So it sounds so cliche to say it comes down to turnout, but in a battleground state like PA, where the R's and the D's are almost tied in registration, it really is a turnout game. And whichever party does a better job of getting their supporters to the polls will really win this thing. I mean, keep in mind, Joe Biden carried Pennsylvania by 1.2 percentage points in 2020. That was about 84,000 votes, I think. When Clinton lost to Trump in 2016, it was something like 42,000 votes. We are talking about an election that presumably could be decided by easily less than 50,000 votes on November 5th. So every vote counts. I think both political parties would be happy with these numbers because it shows the race could go either way, in that everything matters. It matters. The absentee ballot campaign the candidates are running matters. The turnout operation, the job of local committee people to get their people to the polls, who does a better job in advertising, which candidate generates more enthusiasm from all their rallies, which candidate does better radio ads, which candidate has better TV ads. Everything matters when an election this close is about to be decided by presumably, 25 to 50,000 votes. And it's so unusual to see a race this close before. I mean, the margin here is 46 to 45.8. You can't make this stuff up. It's so close.
Do you think the presidential race will have a coattail effect on the down ticket races?
That is such a great question. My fundamental belief has always been, if you're a state representative candidate and you're in a district where the top of the ticket goes big for one candidate, meaning like maybe double digits. So a great example, one of the legislators that both sides of the political aisle are now battling is in the 72nd district in Cambria County. It's represented by a guy named Frank Burns. He's a Democrat state rep. And Republicans have been trying to get rid of him for years, and they never do it. And Frank Burns runs a good campaign, and he's, does his homework, and he gets reelected, despite the fact that Cambria County is now a very red Republican county. Cambria County as a whole, even though the 72nd district is within it, the county of Cambria will likely give Donald Trump a pretty sizable margin, meaning 10 points or more. If that happens, you could see some coattails down ballot for Amy Bradley, who's the Republican candidate running against Frank Burns. That's an example of where coattails could really matter. But in a district where the margin between Trump and Kamala Harris is only a couple points, you're probably more likely to see a lot more ticket splitting down ballot, so you won't see that coattail effect, particularly since Pennsylvania got rid of the straight ticket lever, depending on how you like to say it. That used to be so common in PA, where you can just go in and click one button, and that meant you voted for every Republican or every Democrat. Now you got to take your time and go through each race. And that means there's a propensity to maybe split your ticket a little more than you otherwise would have.
Let's talk about the U.S. Senate race now. The Democratic candidate incumbent Bob Casey comes in at 48.6%. Republican candidate Dave McCormick at 45.8%. 3.6% are not sure. Can you talk a little bit about how these results have tracked over the last several months as well?
Yeah, two things here. Number one, if you're Dave McCormick, you're happy with this poll. Yes, you're still down by about 3 percentage points, but your challenger, Bob Casey, is under 50%. And that's important because Bob Casey is the incumbent. He's been in office 18 years. And somebody needs 51%, right? And there's no third-party candidates running. So if I'm Dave McCormick and I'm looking at these results, I'm thinking, wow, I'm down by 3 points, but that is within the poll's margin of error. So it's almost a statistical tie because the margin of error was 4 percentage points in this poll. Secondly, if Dave McCormick was paying attention to our polling, in our poll in September, we had Bob Casey up by 8 points. This shows some big momentum to Dave McCormick. And what we found was that a lot of Republicans that on the last poll said they were unsure of who they were voting for have now come home and said they're voting for Dave McCormick. So that's put him in a much more competitive situation. So he's down by about 3 percentage points, but this race looks like it's up for grabs as well. Either candidate would be emboldened by these numbers because it shows that you could have a Casey win on November 5th, or you could have a McCormick upset, depending on how those remaining undecided voters break. And what's fascinating about this race, if you wanted to spend an extra minute on it, I pulled some of the numbers from the last time Casey was on the ballot. Casey ran again 6 years ago against Lou Barletta. And at that time, the exit poll showed, and Barletta got creamed. Mm-hmm. I remember the election, it was like an 18-point, landslide for Bob Casey. Casey won independent voters by a 59 to 38 margin, according to CNN exit polling. So that's a pretty big, sizable margin among those independent voters that I mentioned earlier are so important. Right now, independents are split between McCormick and Casey, 39% Casey, 36% McCormick, 18% undecided. So this shows you how much more competitive Dave McCormick is, because he's literally almost tied with Casey among these critical cohort of the population, these independent voters, which will probably be the deciding factor in the election, because most of the undecided voters right now are undecided independents, and how they cast their votes on election day will probably tilt the race in one of the two's favor.
The last question we're going to look at today: who did you vote for president in 2020? 51% say Joe Biden, 44% Donald Trump, 1% other. What can you glean from looking at the voter habits or the responses of how someone voted back in 2020 compared to what we anticipate may happen this year?
So this question, we ask this because there was this phenomenon in 2016 called the shy Trump voter. Mm-hmm. And if you remember the polling back then, most firms didn't predict that Hillary Clinton was going to lose the presidency. Mm-hmm. And a lot of polling that was being conducted at the time undercounted the amount of Trump support that was really out there in the Commonwealth. And this was true in not only Pennsylvania, but in other battleground states as well, where there was this phenomenon called the shy Trump voter. Trump at the time in 2016 was telling Americans, don't pay attention to the polls. Don't believe them. They're corrupt. They're wrong. And as a result, a lot of Trump voters weren't participating in surveys. And as a result, a lot of pollsters missed this shy Trump vote, because he ended up doing much better on election day than the polling was going to suggest. So we include this in our surveys now, because if we don't get enough, we look at the margin between Trump and Biden in this question. It's now 51-44. Well, Biden won the state by only 1.5 percentage points. So from looking at this, it looks like we undersampled Trump voters a little bit, because he got more than 44% in the last election. And why that's important is we can statistically weight the survey to give Trump voters more representation in the current poll, to try to bring them in the line a little better and make the poll more accurate. Now, that's just a theory. Some pollsters will weight by this question and others won't. It really depends on the polling firm. But this is a question that gives us some understanding of how many people that voted for Trump in the past are in our current survey. And I have to make a decision as the guy in charge of the survey about whether or not these results are okay as is, or whether we want to weight the survey to reflect a higher propensity of Trump voters taking the poll. It sounds a little wonkish, I know, but it helps us make sure we can get the most accurate results out to the public.
Are you able to get a sense of whether voters are more enthusiastic to vote for a candidate they like or against a candidate they don't like? And does that make a difference at the polls? It
does make a difference. Typically, the enthusiasm right now, and we didn't do this in our current survey, but in our September survey, we asked a question. We asked voters on a scale of 1 to 10, how enthusiastic are you about your candidate for president, meaning Harris or Trump? And believe it or not, the Harris voters and the Trump voters tied on that question. They were equally as enthusiastic. And that was a big deal, because earlier in the year, when Biden was in the race, there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for Joe Biden. And the Trump voters were more energized than the Biden voters were. But once the Democrats made that swap and they put Kamala Harris in, she reinvigorated the Democratic ticket and brought some new enthusiasm to the campaign. So the fact that each candidate has the same level of enthusiasm suggests to me both campaigns are going to have really good turnout operations on Election Day, because the enthusiasm's there. Now, we know from our polling that a Donald Trump voter isn't a voter against Kamala Harris. It's a vote for Donald Trump. His base loves him. They just adore the man. If you're a Trump voter, you love Donald Trump. If you're a Kamala Harris voter, you might like Kamala Harris, but you hate Donald Trump. And we find in our polling that a Kamala Harris voter is really a vote against Donald Trump, more so than a vote for Kamala Harris. And that's just the reality of the situation.
Now, a few moments ago, you were talking a little bit about voter registration. The Department of State reports that almost 76,000 people left the two major political parties this year and registered as independents or third-party voters. Why do you suspect that's happening?
I think it's happening because more and more people are feeling like the political parties today don't necessarily represent who they are as Americans and as Pennsylvanians. The Democratic Party, for instance, according to many Democrats, has moved to the left. And that's a problem if you're a moderate Democrat. Let's say you're pro-life on abortion, but you're also a Democrat because you believe in labor unions. You might not feel like the Democratic Party stands for you anymore because it's moved further to the left on energy policy, on international policy, on social issues like transgender rights or abortion. So you might be one of those Democrats that thinks, you know what, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not a far left Democrat, but the Democratic Party doesn't represent my interests. So I'd rather be an independent because at least that way I'm not labeled as either Republican or Democrat. On the Republican side, the same thing's probably happening, whereas a lot of Republicans feel like Trump has completely hijacked the Republican Party. There was a time when the Republican Party stood for not only lower taxes, but less spending. Well, under Donald Trump's first 4 years as president, he added to the federal deficit by hundreds of millions of dollars. That is not a Republican Party platform. Neither is tariffs. And Trump has been very bullish about wanting to impose tariffs on international goods coming into our country from other offshore lands. So a lot of Republican voters believe that the Republican Party under Donald Trump doesn't really reflect their interests anymore. And as a result, some of them have left the party and joined the ranks of the independents. The independents now make up 16% of the voter registration records. In many counties, they're the fastest growing party, even above Republicans and Democrats. So those independents are really, a segment of the electorate that candidates have to pay attention to.
One last quick question. Once the polls are closed, the votes are tallied, what will you do to analyze and review what happened on Election Day?
I'm a big believer in looking at the exit polls. I'm a guy that does polling for a living, so the exit polls to me are fascinating because once people get interviewed leaving the polls, we get a sense as to really why they voted the way they voted. Not so much who they voted for, but did they vote for their candidate of choice because of an issue, like abortion or immigration or the economy? Did they vote for the candidate that they just feel has their back, that they like personally, more so than the issues? The exit polls really give us some insights into how people chose to make up their minds on Election Day. And I like to look at the regional groupings of votes, too. We know Pennsylvania is a very different state from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh and everything in between. So how Pennsylvanians cast their ballots in regional areas of the Commonwealth will be particularly interesting to me because when Biden won the state in 2020, he only carried 13 of the 67 counties. So I'll be looking to see how did Kamala Harris do in those 13 counties? Did she win those same 13 counties Biden won? And if so, was that enough to get her over the top? Or did Trump really cut into her margins in some of those Biden counties from 2020?
Jim Lee, President and CEO of Susquehanna Polling Research, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you, Francine.